Okay, thank you all for coming today. So I'm Beckett Sterner. I'm the host who kicks things off for each of the different events in the conversation series. Let me just say, since we've got the spring semester sequence up here, today we'll be talking about are there any ecological conditions that are essential to sustainability, and I'll introduce our panelists in a minute. But coming up next will be Ann Kinzig with Liz Barnes, and they'll be talking about what is the role of the university in solving society's problems. So bring your big thoughts. And then Zachary Horn, who's a new assistant professor, I think just starting this term at ASU, and he'll be talking about the influence of cognitive biases on scientific explanation, together with me, and also a grad student in biology and society, JJ Latourelle. And so we'll be having a conversation about cognitive biases and what recent research can tell us about how science works when there are actual humans involved, right? So the spirit of the conversation series here is that it's not another specialist talk where you sit for 45 minutes and then there's a couple questions at the end. The idea is to create a space for interdisciplinary engagement, which we all like to do, but is often hard to facilitate as a regular practice. And so the way that we've designed it is that we pick big questions. For example, how do you know whether there's anything that you can't substitute for something else in sustainability, right? What about these precious resources like water? Can you actually get by without them? How would you decide? How would you manage sustainability research given that insight? Those aren't questions that you can answer with one discipline alone. You need different perspectives. And so what we've done here is to bring together people interested in these questions to start a conversation. And so Tyler will start us off with a brief introduction, and then we'll open it up to Charles and Ashley, who will be bringing their perspectives. And then the idea is for you to all bring your questions and comments, and for this to be a larger discussion. So not just a back and forth between the person up at the stage and people asking questions. Okay. Just as a reminder, the discussion is being videotaped, and there are going to be microphones up on the ceiling, so try and speak clearly, but we won't have to do the pass the mic around thing, which is great. Okay, so introductions. Really pleased to have Tyler DesRoches here. He's an assistant professor in the School of Sustainability, works on the history and philosophy of biology and economics. And economics. Yeah. And is currently starting a book project on the concept of human well-being. And then Charles Perrings is a professor working on ecosystem services here in the Life Sciences, School of Life Sciences. He's starting a new project tracing the impact of economic trade and globalization on infectious disease.
Been in operation for several years, but yes.
Ever growing. And Ashley Camhi is a PhD student here in the Biology and Society program, working with Charles, and she brings some really cool experience at worldwide agencies investigating and evaluating conservation efforts, and her PhD project is looking at the impact of USDA policies on lake water quality in Iowa. All right, so thank you all again for coming, and I'll pass it off to Tyler.
Great. Thank you, Beckett. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this projecting okay? So this is my research question. I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to kind of like beat around the bush a little bit with this question, and I'm really interested in formalizing these kinds of special ecological conditions that are supposedly essential for somebody who is committed to sustainability. And the perspective that I'll take is the social scientific approach to sustainability. And in particular, I'm interested in economic models of production. These are aggregate models of economic production over time. And in order for any economy to be sustainable over time, according to these models, is that the value of capital is sustained over time. And the reason that matters is because capital is a produced means of production. It helps to produce the things that people consume to then get utility. So it's really all about sustaining utility over time. So that'll be just your standard kind of approach to modeling sustainable development for economists. So there's a debate, unsurprisingly, about weak and strong sustainability. my guess is that most people in this room have probably heard something about this debate. It's not only a debate that's being had among economists. It largely happened in the 1990s, actually. I still think it's a somewhat of a live question. And the worry of those who are wedded to strong sustainability is that, look, there's some stuff out there in the world, and we need to sustain that stuff because it's essential for sustainability. It's non-substitutable. If we get rid of that stuff, then we're going to hell in a handbasket. And whereas weak sustainability, that position is normally construed as a position taken by economists who say, look, technology is going to be there to save us at the end of the day. And, strong sustainability person, why don't you point to me to specific instances of stuff that's non-substitutable? And I'll give you a story of whereas, in fact, these things might come to be substitutable, even if they're not substitutable in a given context. So I think that I can summarize the possibility of the truth of strong sustainability like this. Strong sustainability is true if and only if natural capital, so there's something special about the stock of natural capital, which usually denotes things like ecosystems, which produce ecosystem services and things of that nature, or a subclass of natural capital has no substitutes. Now there's 4 different arguments that I could find for the non-substitutability of natural capital or strong sustainability. The first of which is the existence argument, the Aristotelian argument, the motivation argument. I'm going to say nothing about those arguments. I'm going to focus only on the argument from critical natural capital. Okay? So critical natural capital has been conceived in a few different ways, one of which is that it denotes instances of ecological conditions that are required for continued existence. In other cases, economists say, look, critical natural capital is the stuff that's essential to human welfare. So closely connected notions of critical natural capital, but yet they're separate and distinct. We can clearly imagine a creature, a human organism, with continued existence and with terrible levels of welfare, very low levels of welfare, and yet continuing to exist. So they're separate and distinct. My issue is that nobody has clearly explained what these special ecological conditions might be, and even if they have no substitute, what would in principle constitute a substitute for these kinds of special ecological conditions? And so I want to do 2 things. First, I want to show how one can formally represent critical natural capital qua what I'm calling basic ecological conditions. So critical natural capital, the way I'm conceiving of it, is the set of basic ecological conditions for some creature in a given environment. And we can do this with equations and graphs. Equations and graphs is a causal model that was introduced by computer scientists, and it was developed further by philosophers. So this really is truly a kind of interdisciplinary project. I'm bringing to bear a causal model in philosophy on answering this question in economics. And the second thing, if I have enough time, and I really might not have enough time, is to argue that the substitutability of these basic ecological conditions, they're somehow special. They can't always be explained by subjective factors alone, subjective factors like subjective utility and subjective preferences. Something needs to be said about the world, something objective about these particular characteristics. So equations and graphs, so this might, if you looked at some of these slides from the back and you're just like, oh my goodness, what is this? It looks messy, but it's super simple. Equations and graphs are super simple, especially the way that I'm hoping to introduce it here today. So a causal model, it's just a pair. I think that's gamma, and I think that's epsilon. So gamma is just a set of relevant variables, and epsilon is a set of equations that describe the relationship among them. What do I mean by a variable? In this talk, I'm going to keep variables to just taking a binary value of 1 or 2. And these values, they represent the occurrence or non-occurrence of a specific event. It's raining, E is 1. It's not raining, E is 0. Okay? Very simple. The set of gamma contains some endogenous variables, some exogenous ones too. And the set epsilon, it contains exactly 1 equation for each variable in gamma. All of these equations state the actual value of the variable in question. So they're going to take the form this. And so you have a dependent variable z, and it just depends counterfactually on the values of the variables x, y, and w. Suppose that those were the only 3 variables. If in fact it were the case that x, y, and w were all 1, then we would necessarily have z. And that's a causal relationship. So just some notation. This is just a negation. So the negated x just is 1 minus x. If z, this is a wedge. So if z were to be x or y, then z will take the value of 1 if and only if either x or y take that value. Here we have if z is x and y, then z, whatever variable that is, it'll take on the value of 1 if and only if both x and y take on 1 each. It requires both conditions. And one of the nice things about equations and graphs is that you get this kind of beautiful, well, maybe beautiful is going overboard. You get this nice kind of graphical representation of what it actually looks like, and we can draw arrows from x to z. And the convention is that you draw these arrows if and only if x is a parent of z. And we say that there's a directed path from x to z where there's a sequence of arrows that are lined up connecting those two variables. And again, it's an objective causal relation. Just give you a few examples, quite theoretical examples, I should add. So here, so all these arrows, they represent causal relations. And here, as I said, so the way I'm considering basic ecological conditions is I'm saying the set of basic ecological conditions just is critical natural capital, remember. All of these xi, they're just some basic ecological condition for some creature in a particular environment at some particular time. This variable y, that represents a viable environment for a given organism. And z is the continued existence of some creature. So each one of these xi are necessary conditions to have a viable environment and a necessary condition to have continued existence. That's what that's saying. And we can look at the equations just like this. So this is basically the same as we've just saw. So here we have x1 is the case. It's happening. There's those kinds of basic ecological conditions. The same is true of all xn. Y just equals the combination of all these things. And when all of them are 1, then you have y. You have a viable environment. And you have z equals y. So if you have a viable environment, you have continued existence. The unique solution here in this case, x1 equals 1, x2 equals 1, x3 equals 1, all the way through to xn. They all equal 1. Therefore, we have continued existence for some creature. So basic ecological conditions, they have got no substitutes because they're causal properties. They're not multiply realizable at a particular time and place with a given level of technology. So these are all contextual claims. So here we see none of these variables are multiply realizable according to the arrows that are there. Each one of those is a necessary condition in order to have a viable environment. Of course, that need not be always the case. And I'll demonstrate that with an artificial example. So let's wiggle the technology variable. Suppose that T1, water is the only kind of molecule capable of executing a causal role that's required for the continued existence of some creature, arguably any creature. But suppose at T2, we're able to come up with synthetic molecules that are made available to agents or creatures. These molecules, they afford agents with the same objective causal property as H2O. Well, immediately, we know that CO2, or H2O rather, it ceases to be a basic ecological condition because the causal role it performs in relation to the creature is now multiply realizable in these synthetic molecules. We can represent this with equations and graphs as well. So it's represented with this variable t. So this is I've limited the xi to x1 to 5 just for simplicity. Everything else is the same. I specify x5 as some subsistence quantity and quality of water, and T is some subsistence quantity and quality of functional water, that synthetic molecule that does the same thing as water does. Okay, Y and Z are the same. So the structural equations, they go something as follows. So epsilon includes x1 equals 1. We have everything except we don't have water. But what's functional water? Functional water is the negation of x5. So if there's no water, then you know you have this synthetic molecule that's available to agents that performs the causal role. The viable environment just includes all these variables, except this is different. Now we have x5 or t. If either one of those are satisfied, then it's the case that you'll have a viable environment provided you have all these variables met. And z equals y. So if you have a viable environment, I'm just assuming you have continued existence of the agent, of the creature. So in contrast to the previous example, x5, 0, but we have this. And so the solution to these equations, it's also unique. X1 equals 1. These are all the same variables. X5 takes a value of 0. T is 1, so there's the synthetic molecule. There's no water. And we have continued existence for some creature, now without any water. Again, a highly idealized artificial example, but just to demonstrate what would in principle constitute a substitute for these kinds of basic ecological conditions. It's the fact that these molecules, or whatever it is that we're talking about, these basic ecological conditions, they're denoting certain kinds of causal relations between a creature and its environment. So we might define a basic ecological condition, something like this. I'm not super happy with this definition so far, but this is what I have. X is a basic ecological condition for agent alpha in environment E at time t, and this is if and only if. If and only if all variables other than x were held fixed at their values at t, and x were removed from E, then alpha would cease to exist, maybe not immediately, but shortly thereafter. I should have a look at the time. So this will be the last point that I make, and it's about the potential substitutability of these things. So the way that we think of, and Charles will tell you more clearly than I can probably explain, the way that we normally think of the substitutability of goods in standard microeconomic consumer choice theory is to say that some good serves as a substitute for a particular agent, as long as they're along the same indifference curve. As long as you were to take some good away from that agent, you replace it with a good that provides the same level of utility, the same level of welfare for that agent. But when it comes to these special basic ecological conditions, it's a little bit different because we have to account for the objective causal role that's being played by the world, by these conditions in the world. And it can't always be explained by subjective factors alone. So there's two conditions. X affords the same objective causal role to the agent as X, and I call that a functional substitute. And this second condition, Y leaves the agent as well off subjectively as X. And so you have this kind of dual requirement that's imposed on these kinds of conditions in particular circumstances. Well, actually, in every circumstance. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that, and then I guess we'll start the conversation.
Why don't you guys come to the front? And so what we'll do here is that Charles and Ashley will give some thoughts or alternative perspectives on the issue of substitutability, other things they want to pick up in Tyler's talk. And then once we've got their first takes, then we can open it up and everyone can start to participate and pitch in, and we'll have the broader discussion.
Hang on. No, I wouldn't collapse it. It seems inappropriate to have Ashley sitting down.
Now I feel like a pharmacist. I got to go down too.
Okay, do we need to talk into a mic, or is this all going to work? We do. Okay. Right, so I'm going to start, then Ashley will give comments, and Ashley will in fact chair this and try and keep us on time and in order and raise questions and so on. Mm-hmm. But thank you very much, Tyler. This is a very interesting question for people in the biological sciences, whether or not there are pieces of nature that are so essential that they should be conserved in perpetuity. And it's also, it turns out, a very interesting question for economics. Long standing question. If you go back to actually the end of the war, John von Neumann published a really important paper on the nature of economies in which you have things called basic goods. Where basic goods, I think what he would have had in mind for that is some sort of energy source, oil. But water works pretty well as a basic good. And there have been a series of contributions since then. Pierre Straffer made one in the 1960s, Michio Morishima, also in the 1960s. Luigi Pasnetti, 1980. I published a book on this myself in 1987.
On this topic?
On this same topic, on the problem of basic goods, and what it does to, what are the conditions that have to be satisfied if you have basic goods in an economy that are essential to production of other things. And it does turn out that it's really important. If there are commodities that are essential to the production of all other commodities, then they constrain the system in important ways. That they limit the capacity for the growth of that system. They limit the capacity to operate if the quantity of those commodities decreases. A commodity here that economists would often think about as something like oil, but you could also think about it as a component of natural capital. So it could be thought about as water supplies, or it could be thought about as particular ecosystems. The devil, however, is always in the details. So you can identify basic goods if they exist in reality. And our challenge has always been to find what the limits of a basic good are in any given reality. And why this is important is that they are so specific to time and place. So we know that water is essential in abstract, but we also know that people in parts of the Sahel in Africa survive on quantities of water that we couldn't survive on here. We know that it's very, very sensitive to technology. It's very, very sensitive to institutions, to culture, and so on. So when is something essential, and how dependent is that on the particular property rights, institutions, and technologies? And how can those change? How do those change? So from an economic perspective, if things become more scarce, you expect that there will be investment in trying to increase their availability. And you would expect to see technology change over time, and you would expect to see some alteration in the boundaries. Question is, are there boundaries that hold for all periods, all circumstances, all time? And it's really hard to find those. You can find them in abstract. Water is essential, but water in general. And you've got to determine for a particular time and place what quantities of water you would need, what qualities of water you would need, and so on. And Ashley will say a little bit about that. The one other thing I would raise for the people here is that you've made an interesting observation that your definition of something being essential is that if you took it away after that, you were referring to a species, the species would cease to exist, that it would cause, in a short while, a collapse. And for a lot of the most interesting basic environmental goods, the question is not so much about whether there will be a collapse, but when. So there are parts of the environment that if you take them away now have no immediate consequence, but will have a consequence if certain conditions emerge in the future. So if something is essential in certain environmental conditions, you have to wait on those environmental conditions for their disappearance to have an impact. And some of these lags can be really long. So some of them may be a year or two, but others could be hundreds or thousands of years. And I'll leave it at that and pass over to Ashley.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Charles. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk, and then I'll open it up for questions. And I think I'll just pose some of the questions myself. I'm just curious, out of the people that are here, how many people work on like applied research versus theoretical? Okay, so like some people. So I work basically only on applied research. So it's been really interesting for me to read your manuscript and sort of think through this and how you would actually think about it in an applied sense. And I think Charles already mentioned this. It's really interesting from a philosophical perspective, definitely from a scientific perspective, but more importantly, at least for me, from an economic perspective, when you start to think about human well-being and welfare, and how does this sort of play into that? And Charles mentioned some of these already, that, you know, all of these things in real life are subject to so many different types of constraints. I mean, there's social constraints, like you mentioned, institutions, laws, certainly technology plays a really big part, and natural constraints as well. So when I was going through this, I was thinking about substitutability in terms of, you know, on one hand, what you talk about in terms of natural capital and manufactured capital, but also could you think about a situation where you would substitute natural capital for other types of natural capital as well? So that's something I thought would be interesting to talk about. And can you think about, I think it was your second condition where you talk about leaving the agent just as well off when you do this substitutability. Could you think about a situation where you're actually improving the agent's welfare? I was trying to think of some real life examples where you might think about that. And I don't know if the example I came up with really hits on it being critical natural capital, but generally in terms of natural capital, I was thinking about substitutability in terms of energy. So if you think about like oil, coal, other types of energy, and you think of more renewable types of energy such as solar or wind, could you think about that type of substitutability of natural capital for other types of natural capital actually improving people's well-being because you have decreased pollution, increasing people's health, other types of positive benefits? So I think I'll open it up for questions. I think we've all sort of posed sort of different angles of it, but I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about it, and I'll try and keep us on time and on topic. So.
Great. Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out what the overarching goal is. Are we trying to say that we can get a different molecule than water? Or are we trying to say we could find a different source of water? Or we're trying to say we could somehow engineer ourselves, our environment, so that we could drink crappy water filled with E. coli and survive? Or any of those three?
Very good question.
I think the analysis that I put forward, I think it could allow for any of those things, really. Any of those motivational states in terms of what we might go after pragmatically.
All it says is, in a convoluted way, it says, if we have something that also serves as water, we don't need water. Which I didn't need math to do, right? Mm-hmm. So what is that thing? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, so water was one example of that. I hope. I mean, the claim about causation. Hopefully, that was a little bit informative, but maybe not. But because it's not normally causation, at least in the way that many economists typically think of these things. It's when we think about the substitutability of just ordinary goods, it's about maintaining an agent welfare at minimum. I think a good that also made the agent better off, that would also satisfy the requirement to constitute a substitute.
But Mike, let me take this.
Yeah, sure.
Let me take this question. What underlies the thing that Tyler first started to show us was that if you write a particular function that relates an output of interest to a set of inputs of interest, then the form of that function matters. And he gave us a very particular example. Empirically, what we're trying to do is to understand what the relationship is between the output of things that people care about to the input of either pieces of capital or material inputs or environmental inputs. And then we want to figure out what the scope for substitutability between those is, whether there are limits to that, whether there are not. And we've got polar cases. So there's fixed coefficient technologies where there really is no limit for substitutability. You've got to have one input in a particular quantity, another in a particular quantity, and it never changes. That's one polar case. Another would be perfect substitutability. Almost all of the production functions that we found to be empirically reliable include some complementarity between inputs, so some limits to substitutability. And the empirical question is, when does that matter? In the case of water, we know that it's possible to desalinate. And there's a lot of water out there if we can start to desalinate on a large scale. But at what cost? And it's the cost that will determine when and where you're interested in substituting water, fresh water falling from clouds for water created through reverse osmosis from the oceans.
In this kind of modeling, it depends on what Z, Y, and Z are, right? Well, but basically, it depends on what you're willing to deal with. And as you pointed out, most people don't live the way we are. We had this nice lunch with these, like, terribly packaged drinks, right? Look how many I drink. And we're going to throw all these away. And, like, to me, that's got to be part of the conversation. What are we trying to sustain? Are we trying to sustain everyone living the way they are now? Are we trying to sustain social classes? Are we trying to sustain the average quality of life? How are we defining well-being? Right? Because actually my kids are no happier than they are now with their Xbox 360 than I was through with my Atari 2600. Because it was novel to me. And then before that, I was super thrilled to have Pong. Right? So in this analysis, are we considering the fact that we have a certain amount of dopamine to release?
Your kids are in the model, actually.
And where we are, we're going to release it. I mean, like, I've seen kids in Africa play with trash because it's shiny and novel, right?
Yeah.
And they're getting that dopamine release. So in that conversation, are we planning for that? How does that factor into these equations?
So maybe
those are big issues, right?
For sure, I think that's probably the biggest issue. It's the elephant in the room. So the most people think that economists presuppose a subjective preference theory of value. So whatever it is that a person prefers, and that's usually over commodity bundles or a state of affairs, when that preference is satisfied, the person is made better off. So it's not even a reference to a mental state, or it hasn't been since like the 1950s, 1940s. It's just and utility is just a representation of those preferences, of the preference structure of a particular agent. So now we might, if that's true, and economists are presupposing that theory of well-being, then we might readily actually say, well, look, that theory of well-being is clearly subject to counterexamples. It seems like people can form all kinds of nasty subjective preferences that either have nothing to do with their well-being, or that when those preferences are satisfied, they're made worse off. So that can't be the true theory of well-being. So, pardon me?
Heroin.
Exactly. Well, exactly. An addiction to heroin. I'm addicted to heroin, and I prefer it. I prefer a world where I just constantly get my fix. I think it's an open question whether or not I'm being made better off every time that my preferences are satisfied. And so we might have to look elsewhere for a better account of what human well-being actually is. And
is there an alternative or complementary framework where people try to manage people's utility?
Yeah, behavioral economics.
Right.
Behavioral
That
economics.
would be the key sustainability, right? Is to lower people's expectations.
I guess then you're running into some difficult political quandaries, about paternalism and things of that nature, about, shaping people's lives intentionally to bring them more in line with what you think is good for that person. So there's going to be a tension there with that kind of strategy.
Tyler, also something that I was running into that I think is a bit of what you're getting onto is like all of this is based on the premise of critical natural capital. Mm-hmm. So it's like how do you I mean, you have a mathematical equation, but like in reality, how do we define critical natural capital as opposed to just how we would imagine natural capital? Like that seems a bit subjective as well.
You just asked a philosopher about reality. That's scary. No, this is. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say. So this is. I mean, I'll acknowledge it's a very kind of theoretical piece, mm-hmm. and with an artificial example here today. And I'm just trying to get clear in my mind, I guess. First, what it is that I'm trying to say, mm-hmm. And the next step I think would be to consider a question in slightly more applied terms. And I think that one way in which you might think about one promising kind of case where you might go with this, and we discussed this the other day when we met, was to connect, these very like specific instances of these basic ecological conditions that are doing the right causal thing for us, connecting those up to being necessarily connected to, say, an ecosystem. And if there is that necessary connection between the production of those basic ecological conditions and something larger and something more manageable like an ecosystem, then the argument is, wow, we need this thing in order for our welfare, not to mention our continued existence.
Jane, did you have a question?
Yeah, I feel like I'm quicksand a little bit here and not quite sure I understand what's really fully at issue. So in particular, that statement that you have right there, basic ecological conditions are different from ordinary goods and consumer choice theory. From Ashley's point of view of applied systems, is that a true statement?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean, and why is it a true statement, and ought it to be a true statement, or why aren't these things all the same? Anyway, I'm confused at that level.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe just to jump in, because I had a related question. In the models that Tyler set up, as I understood it, we're considering the ability for a single individual agent to survive, given these different conditions. But and part of the goal there is to say we can't understand that just in terms of subjective preferences of the agent and their fulfillment. We actually have to take care of the causal structure of the world in which the agent gets to live. And so you're arguing we need to step out of just ranking the preferences of the agent and looking at how those preferences are sort of quantitative, right? How they add up to the same level or not. But to really say, like, look, we can't just measure utility. We have to look at the causal structure of the things that provide that utility. And so that's to shift out of the economic utility framework and say, what's the underlying ecology or environmental causes that these agent requires? And to say that that's a necessary condition is to set up the problem in a different language.
It is.
What I was wondering is that the way that you've set up the model right now is very individualistic, right? So it's this agent has these 10 conditions that are necessary in order for the agent to survive. But part of the idea of political philosophy and public goods is that money often stands in for a lot of different things because of markets. So I would wonder how we might make it more realistic from an economic point of view by saying we have limited goods, right? So it's not just that one agent on its own doesn't have water, but that there's not enough water for all of the agents in the world. And one agent could survive if they also got some money, because they can buy the water and then raise the price so high that the other person can't afford it, or however you want to construct it. But in that sense, not just model the causal necessary conditions for each agent as if they existed alone, but to think about exchangeability explicitly with some kind of public fungible good like money.
Yeah, no, that's great.
One more, Tyler, and you can answer these in any order, I guess. The collective. I'm all for survival, right? But sustainability—that seems to me to be like the minimal condition of what sustainability is, right? How does the difficulties that you're having just with this project and the complexities? How does this then intersect with sort of getting at, I think, what Beckett's starting to talk about when we think of sustainability is maintaining a certain set of social or political goods or preconditions for a certain kind of life that is beyond just subjective preferences. Might assume certain institutional arrangements, whether it's Rawlsian or whatever, but the sustainability becoming a more communal project. It's certainly about survival, but it's about all that other stuff too. It seems to rise above the level of just individual preference. So is this sort of a ground level approach that then we can build?
I'm hoping so, yeah.
Okay.
I'm hoping so. And I can't say that this is my central project either. This is just kind of a thing that we're working on. But I really do hope that it could connect up causally to these other, say, institutional arrangements or larger ecosystems. But I think that Beckett probably explained my project better than I did there by just saying that this is meant to be kind of like a surprising thing where you can't completely explain the substitutability of these special things by virtue of looking at the agent's preference structure and subjective utility alone. You have to actually talk about the world. And that's, I think, just a really surprising thing for a social science like economics. And it might be, completely obvious for ecologists and biologists. Well, of course, the material world. Where were you all this time anyways?
Well, there have been a lot of economists who've been around this for a long time, and who realize that there's an interaction between what it is that societies want and what the world can deliver. And it does require collaboration across disciplines, and there are many, many disciplines that are involved. But the issue has always been posed at the level of a system, and not at the level of an individual. I mean, what does it make? What sense is there to an individual being sustainable? I mean, there's no sense to an individual unless you analyze that individual as a system. So what we're doing within this broader project in economics is to ask, first of all, what do societies want? Which is Mike's question. What is it that different societies seek to achieve given their resources available to them? And then secondly, what does it take to meet those needs? And where can they relax constraints imposed by their physical environment, and where not?
And how do you answer the first question? I'm curious. Determining what it is that a society wants through like a deliberative democratic framework or something?
It's done. Oh, thanks. It's done through a variety of different methods, and this again involves collaboration across multiple disciplines. So it's not just economics. It's politics. It's sociology, anthropology have all got a take on this. But essentially, if you reduce it to the kind of mechanics that you were talking about here, you would have a mechanism for developing a social welfare function. And that social welfare function would be the product of the politics of a particular society and the limitations imposed by the fact that it's one amongst many different societies. And you would then use that as the criterion by which you choose to allocate the resources that enter as the arguments of your production function. But in this case, it would be an aggregate production function dealing with production of all the goods and services that people in society want. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, the arguments of that function would include all of the environmental goods and services that make that happen. Some of which are global, the general circulation system, some of which could be really quite local, rivers and streams locally, for example. But it is an approach that in economics is almost always handled at the level of a system and is handled at a much higher level of aggregation than would be implied by an individualistic approach.
So we have about 15 minutes, just so you guys know, so definitely take some more questions.
So I admit to be a novice in all of this, so this question may be not very articulate. But so Charles Perrings, you're talking a lot about what societies want. What if societies don't want to be sustainable? What if they don't want sustainability? Then how does that fit into what's going on here? Like, how do you balance what societies want, but also we'd like to continue existing as a planet and as a species on that planet?
Societies that don't want to be sustainable are few and far between, because not wanting to be sustainable means that you want to have a party, and at the end of the party you're going to collapse and die. So most societies will give at least lip service to sustainability, but understanding what they think they can get away with, because a lot of what we're trying to do at the moment is to live off others. We're trying to achieve levels of consumption that, if we were the only society in the world, would not be sustainable. We can achieve them because we can exploit others elsewhere in the world. Collectively, where we're headed is something that is going to require reduction in consumption levels in the more affluent countries, and hopefully will generate an increase in consumption levels elsewhere. But all societies profess to want to maintain what they've currently got, and that means that they're looking for sustainability.
Yeah, I think it also just goes back to like the definition of sustainability, which maybe is what you're getting at, right? And so you know, talking about weak sustainability versus strong sustainability. I mean, if you go into the School of Sustainability here and you talk to someone, you're going to get maybe a different definition if you ask someone, you know, in Seoul. So I think, you know, having the basic premise of what Charles is talking about, which is, you know, maintaining our existing level, or, you know, possibly improving it, but not at the expense of others, is really important. So, but I think it gets confusing when you think about, you know, so many people define sustainability differently. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was going to say, I agree with her, but I'm not sure exactly where she's going, but I think you might be going somewhere along the lines of what people really want, if we're honest, is as a society, we want to be better than all other societies. And within a society, Ben and I want to be better than everybody else. Like, that's what makes people happy. The happiness would indicate it's all relative, right?
People in Canada don't believe that.
Yeah, they say that. They want the Americans to think because we're paying for their...
Trudeau doesn't lie.
They're outsourcing defense, so I mean, why not? They got to tell us that. But in reality, like if we model organisms as an evolving population, there's no way we're prepared for this problem, right? Our basic instincts are all wrong. So we have to figure out how to screw ourselves over, how to like basically fool ourselves. And without that paternal thing we mentioned before, you said that could be a politically problem, we're doomed. Because if we don't have some sort of large...
You don't think we're educable?
We're the most educated people in this, and look how horrible we are. Trash I see going out of this place.
I have a lot of self-loathing.
I don't care. I don't think it matters a whit what happens. Like 100, 200 years from now, I don't think it's going to matter, right? I'm not going to be around. But the reality is we have to take a hard look at those real constraints, right, that have evolved in us. And so if we are only basing this on utility of what individuals want, I can tell you, we've been ramping up towards more and more because the Joneses thing is real, right? Like if everyone here got a pay cut and I didn't get a pay cut, I'd be super happy right now. That's the kind of situation I think that drives. So happy not that they got a pay cut, but that I didn't, right?
See, but there seems to be. I mean, if you look at some of the empirical evidence though coming out of like people like Kahneman and Diener, and I think you might be apprised of this kind of literature, right? They say, look, we've got some evidence that a certain kind of happiness, it kind of caps out. There's a satiation point at like 80 grand a year or something. So it's one thing to be apprised of that evidence. It's another thing for that evidence to become part of my internal motivational structure to how I actually change my consumptive behavior. But at least it's a start. It's a start to say, if I'm basically committed to the value of my own welfare, my own well-being, and I want to be an informed person, there's all this empirical evidence out there which says that. The assumptions in microeconomic models like monotonicity or local non-satiation, those are false empirically. And I think that we can, redirect our consumption patterns to being more prudential out of my own self-interest, but all the while reducing consumption.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. So, sorry, again, math is like not my thing, but your variables are usually like 0 or 1 based on a substitution. Right? Mm-hmm. So the 0 means there's a substitution somewhere if you have another variable.
Yeah, if in that example with the teeth, that's what it meant for that one. Yeah.
So it seems like basic ecological conditions like water, it doesn't seem like we'll have a substitute very soon. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't you just like have a variable for like if having an oil pipeline like messes with your water, that seems a lot more like a choice a consumer would make rather than like I have a substitute for water. So could you why are those variables not being considered?
I think they could be. I think these extremely bare bones basic models, I think they could be made more complex. And there's no reason. So I have basic ecological conditions and I'm thinking of like natural factors, natural causal factors, but the same could be true of artifacts like pipelines. And you might have a certain particular creature at a particular environment at some time with a given level of technology, and some of those variables might very well be artifacts. There's no need for them to be natural variables themselves. So I think you could account for that.
There's no need for the function to have that particular binary form, 0, 1.
Yeah,
you could
right.
have a continuous range of all sorts of variables that trade off against each other.
Yeah.
But just to jump in there for a second, I think one way to formulate Mike's problem is maybe you can't fully exit facts about subjective preferences if it's a biological feature of humankind that we might have one preference to continue surviving,
but we're unable to actually put that preference above short-term pleasure.
Right.
So it might be that, yes, intellectually, I would love to not die tomorrow, but boy, I'm still going to have a party tonight.
Yeah. So I think
all of the natural causes could be lined up in the graph. Yeah. But if the agent has again an objective property that it's not able to ensure, let's say, the continuation of some of those variables through its actions, then it's going to die even if all of the appropriate conditions are available, because the agent messes with the causal structure of the process. So if I take Mike's worry right, it's that just talking about the world and not considering constraints on the agent's ability to control its own actions might lead to collapse, even if the world provided all the initial conditions the agent needed.
So I think that one promising way to address that particular worry is the examination of acrasia, or weakness of will. And there are particular, empirical proven kind of tests or ways in which you can actually work on your self-discipline and work on self-command. And this is actually something that Adam Smith talks about in his theory of moral sentiments. So anyway, that's what makes me think of that. When you
very nicely put, Beckett. Very nicely put.
It was.
You explain the problem that drives all of environmental and resource economics, because it's exactly the disconnect between the incentives that people have to behave in particular ways and the reality within which they operate. And we've got lots of different ways to deal with this problem. And one of them might be to, through education, encourage people to behave in a different way. But education works pretty slowly. And so we've got a bunch of other mechanisms too. There are laws, there are norms, social norms, there are incentives. We're all Pavlovian dogs of one kind or another. And you can change people's behavior in the short term in the interests of society. So an individual may be very self-centered, short-sighted, may have no care for the rest of the world, but you can still alter their behavior by changing the signals within which they operate. Things like relative prices and so on. But sending people to jail sometimes is also a handy way of altering their behavior.
Andrew, did you have a question?
You actually brought up that you want to be very practical about this. I'm sitting there trying to think of a real-world situation where decisions have to be made. Charles indicated individuals aren't really at risk here, but there are populations, there are societies. And the problem, one of the problems is what those populations actually consist of. And I was thinking of, say, the decision of what to do with bears here. So with it, do the local people count, or what world was Zinke thinking of, or Trump, if they're going to basically do away with this protected area? And there are all sorts, and so you have the uranium, which might be one of your little Y figures or something such as that, but you have cultural constraints, and you have all this other, and you have different spatial scales. And I think the problem with spatial scales and having different populations that think differently about things is really one of the big challenges in conservation, that when you're trying to think about any form of sustainability, because what's sustainable for someone who says, well, we need uranium because it's going to be this function, or we need the cultural resource. And people think differently. Right. I mean, when I was a kid, I was standing looking over Yosemite Valley from the tunnel overlook, and the car pulled up next to us, and the lady got out and tapped her husband on the shoulder and said, honey, where is the view? Looking at Yosemite Valley. So everybody thinks differently. And so that's really one of the big challenges in a practical sense, is to define what the population is. So you even know where the boundaries are when you're doing an exercise such as this, right? At least in my opinion. Good point.
One more question, and then if you want to summarize.
I've got a question about sort of how this works fundamentally, in terms of if you're making inferences about objective causal rules, do we have to have some assumption that a particular system or group of systems are either open or closed systems? Does that matter in the way that these causal rules work? How does that factor in?
Yeah, so causal inference is going to be, so I didn't answer my research question. I didn't answer the question on the first slide, because that's partly or almost completely an empirical question. And I think that causal inference will be different in different circumstances, whether this or not the system is open or closed, to make the answer short.
But it's true.
Did that
the structure of the system is critical.
Mm-hmm.
In all
Absolutely.
cases.
Yeah.
Because if you describe the technology of a system in some sort of linear terms, as we have here, then just imagine this as a matrix in which you have the elements of that matrix describing the combinations of commodities that are useful to produce something. The structure of the matrix gives you everything. And if it's completely indecomposable, everything is basic, and you can't do without anything. If it's completely decomposable, you've just got a whole lot of different systems, each of which is closed and not connected with the others. Mm-hmm. So knowing how a particular system connects with the rest is critical.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Tyler, do you want to just say a few words to wrap up?
Just want to say thank you. Yeah, that's.
We have a new economist in the room.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was helpful for me to come to grips with what Tyler set up as the novel thing in the model, and then it really comes down to the structure of what's in there and whether or not we have to include the agent as, in some sense, part of the causal structure. Not necessarily in terms of subjective utility anymore, but something more like a capacity of the agent to ensure that certain necessary resources are maintained over time, despite other preferences. I think I liked how that
brought back the economic and individual perspective into the notion of causal structure.
Any more questions? We still have a minute or two. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was great.
Thanks very
so
much.
much.
Thank you very much. That was great. Yeah.